I am Ricci Levy. I'm one of the founders and I'm the CEO of the Woodhull Freedom Foundation. We were founded in 2003. We're a human rights organization, and our work occurs at the intersection of sexual and human rights. I want to welcome you to the conversation we're all going to have this afternoon. And I'm delighted to be here with a few of my friends. Before I go any further, I want to thank our 2021 sponsors, Enjoy Toys, the U.S. Human Rights Network, Walters Law Group, and the Tides Foundation. Okay, so Diego, wave your hand, Diego, please. Thank you. Diego Miguel Sanchez lives in Washington, D.C. He's the Director of Advocacy, Policy, and Partnerships for PFLAG. Does that all fit on a card? It's a long title.
Yeah, it's like 4-point type.
I got it. Okay.
It fits, but you can't read it.
I got it. So as the Senior Policy Advisor to Congressman Barney Frank, my friend Diego made history with that appointment as the first openly transgender person to work as a senior legislative staff member on Capitol Hill. He also testified before Congress in the historic transgender discrimination hearing. That was in 2008. And that same year was named as the first openly trans person ever appointed to the DNC Platform Committee.
Yay!
Those few small accomplishments are just this tiny little bit of a lifetime of advocacy and passion and engagement. Nadine Smith, wave, thank you. So Nadine Smith, who lives in Tallahassee, Florida, founded Equality Florida in 1997 in an effort, according to Nadine, to make the world safer for me. Equality Florida is now the largest organization in Florida, working for full LGBTQ rights. Among too many accomplishments to list in the time we have this afternoon, let's just say that Nadine has been an outspoken advocate for anti-hate crimes and anti-bullying legislation. I like to say that Nadine, I'm taking this from a workshop that was done based on Nadine's work. Nadine had the balls to turn a red state blue. She's done it. Mandy Carter, wave your hand. Thank you. Mandy Carter hails from Atlanta, Georgia. Mandy was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize as one of the 1,000 women in 2005. That recognized, made visible, and celebrated the peace work of thousands of women around the world. She's been recognized for her work on LGBT civil rights in the US, and I'm delighted to say is a member of the board of directors for Woodhull. Cormier Maggiano lives in Washington, D.C. Would you raise your hand and wave? Thank you. He's the president and founder of Cormier and Company and advises funders, issue advocates, and movement leaders on the ways to achieve their policy, political, and philanthropic goals. I can tell you that Chris's work centers at the intersection of progressive public policy, national campaigns, and his passion for social justice is an inspiration and is reflected in everything Chris does. So these are four of my friends, and we're gonna have a conversation today after I take a drink of water. About sexual freedom in a time of hope. We've done programs, sexual freedom in the time of Trump. That was depressing.
That was depressing.
That was. Yes, we've done sexual freedom in the two epidemics, AIDS and the current pandemic. Today we're going to talk about hope. We won the election, historic election. We got to see last night an extraordinary sight and to hear extraordinary messages of hope. But what does that mean in practical terms? What do we do with that information in practical terms? I'm going to start by asking Nadine to share with us what's happening in Florida, what's coming up in Florida, and how she sees the future in this administration. You have 2 minutes. No, I'm totally kidding. You have as long as you need, but you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I'll do it in 2 minutes. Here's what I will say, because Florida is a microcosm of the United States. I think that's what's so compelling about doing the work there. It is, it's a purple state that can shift red or blue, depending on how many folks from the Midwest move there at any given time. And so we from our beginning have always been organizing with Republicans in leadership. And so what I want to focus on is, in this time of hope, what I think we need to be paying attention to. And one of those things is that those divisions haven't gone away. And in many ways, we're experiencing the backlash to the Biden victory more acutely in the states, where we have seen a whole raft, an unprecedented number of anti-LGBTQ bills introduced, specifically bills that target the trans community. And so, Stacey Abrams said it right when she said the South isn't red, it's suppressed. And voter suppression and the machinery of democracy being dismantled is the biggest threat to our democracy and our individual liberties. And it is red states or Republican-controlled states that are sharpening the tools of taking those democracies, those democratic safeguards apart. The reason that everyone ought to be paying attention to what is happening around the targeting of trans youth in particular is because not only is it an assault on a very vulnerable population, it is also an assault on gender, and it is about controlling bodies, particularly women's bodies. And all of these things are tied together. It's not an accident that you see the same homophobic legislators and transphobic legislators at the forefront of legislation that restricts the right to make our own reproductive choices and so on. And so what we just saw was, despite a huge outcry from the community, from all quarters, where we were able to stop that bill from moving forward in the Senate, in an 11th hour maneuver yesterday, the House attached an anti-trans bill to a completely unrelated bill, a charter bill, moved it to the Senate, and now we await whether or not Governor DeSantis is going to sign this bill. It all happened very fast. Lots of backroom deals were cut. And, here is a bill that would kick any trans girl off of any sports team in Florida. And it's not based on anything that's happened. It was an orchestrated, it was a bill that was filed in 30 plus states, orchestrated by a right-wing think tank for the purpose of making the trans community the focus of the culture war, to continue to throw red meat to that base that, and not only to the base, but also what's really insidious about it was intended to force people that we once thought of as moderate Republicans to take a stand in the culture war. This was their loyalty test, and they capitulated to Trumpism. So that's the bad news, is that bill is moving forward. But the good news is that we consistently center the voices of trans young people, their families, their coaches, their teammates. We, what you saw, if you watched this play out, you saw the LGBT caucus and the Black caucus leading the charge to oppose this. And I think it's reflected in polling that just came out just less than a week ago that shows 3/4 of Americans think that these anti-trans bills are bad, that they're wrongheaded, and that they're cruel. And so while that third that doesn't believe that may be the base that the Republicans are playing to, they're losing the numbers game. They're losing the hearts and minds game. It's going to do a lot of damage before we get to that tipping point where we can undo what they've done. But, that's always been the work of the LGBTQ community, where, we might lose at the beginning, but we lose forward. We change hearts and minds. We cause people to come out and tell their stories. And that's the work that is ahead for us.
Thank you, Nadine. Diego, you weren't next in my list, but something that Nadine just said reminded me of something in your past. Didn't you win? You lettered in something, right? Would you share? Just.
Yes, I thought I was going to have to. I thought I was going to get into a story. I was like, no, I was out of town. I was at Nadine's house, and I didn't do it.
I'll always provide an alibi for you, Diego. That's the agreement.
Yes. So, yeah, this whole thing with trans sports and athletes who are trans being harmed, and there's I'll do a real quick one, but I got to add something that I don't think I've talked about. The thing that is known to Ricky is that I am a letterman, a tennis letterman, G Club member, meaning letterman. I'm a Rhodes Scholar candidate, which you may or may not know. But I was a female tennis player at the University of Georgia, a Division I university. And I played as a masculine female. Fortunately, we didn't always have to wear tennis dresses, but I have lived through times and places later after college where I did. And I want to tell you about one. And this became the corporation that really stood behind me during all the phases of my transition, is ITT Corp, which was headed by a West Point graduate. Let's just be clear. But one of the things that happened is we had this, I worked for ITT Sheraton, and we had this we went to California and played at all the wonderful tennis places. So you had to have all white clothes. And then you had, just about all white people except for us who were visiting, a couple of us. But I definitely did not have an all white tennis dress with me. I had all white tennis wear, and they said that anybody who's female has to wear a dress. And I did the whole conniption fit in front of my CEO, COO, the CFO. And that CFO later became the COO of ITT, who was also the founder of MLB.com. And it explains some of the things, like he always told me, you're the bravest man I ever met. He says that what you faced and went against corporations where people said, here's your scarf. And you're like, no, I want a tie. And you always got the tie, not the scarf, as the company talisman. He goes, you were brave. And, and the one time he saw me have an anxiety attack was when we were in Detroit, and we went, his name's Bob Bowman, Robert R. Bowman, and Robert A. Bowman. And we went to Detroit because we were going to convert the Renaissance Center into what we hoped would be a Sheraton hotel. And you go and you meet with the mayor, and you meet with the governor, and you meet with the corporation. It was owned by GM. And so I was like, oh my God, I haven't worn a dress in forever. And we're doing this thing, this presentation. And oh God, I can't stand it. So I told all the guys, I'm like, look, I'm going in khakis. I'll go to the bathroom and I will change into a dress. Or actually, no, I'll change it to a skirt and jacket because I can't wear a dress. And before I get on the company jet, I'm putting back on my khakis in the building because I can't. And I swear, I ended up holding up the company jet because I needed that extra 3 minutes that we didn't have, but I wasn't leaving the building in the skirt. And of all the female born people, all the GM people were wearing slacks. I was the only one in a skirt. And that day I told all the executives, like, okay, I rarely suck it up, but I'm never sucking it up again. This is no. If people who are actually identified as females have to do this, I'm not ever doing it because I don't. And so my whole college career where, you know, I always practiced with men. I played with men. I beat the heck out of men. And it was certainly harder at Division I tennis because those men could kick my butt. But skill is skill. And people are not intimidated by people who are athletes. And the only part of the arguments regarding women's sports that I don't like when they're talking about trans athletes is that they try to say these are girls and they're just trying to have fun. And the purpose of sports is for people to get along with each other and learn teammate stuff. And that is true. But asking us not to use the word competition or winning is a disgrace to women's sports. And I say that as a former woman athlete who didn't want to be a woman, but wanted to be an athlete. So my heart is there, but I worry that we compromise the integrity of what women's sports is and girls sports is. Don't tell me third graders who are playing don't want to win, because they do. Now they also need to learn how to lose because that's part of sports. But I don't think that people playing together is harmful, and that should be the centering around our messaging and not compromising away the quality or intent or integrity of women's sports. So I may have gone too long, but that's my story.
I'm glad I asked you. Thank you for answering. Mandy Carter. Mandy Carter, who's on our board. Mandy, tell us what's happening in Georgia.
Well, first of all, I want to say this is so wonderfully profound to be with Diego, Chris, Nadine, and you, just having joined the board. We've known each other, other people who've known each other for years. And I was sitting commenting about Nadine back in 2000. That was what, 21 years ago, right? Am I correct? Yeah. We had this amazing campaign at Quality Florida. We were trying to get a lot of Black folk ready to vote. And we had that incredible Gore v. Bush campaign. But the fact that we're having this conversation now, Ricci, I watched yesterday when we had Biden's speech, when you had the first ever woman of color Vice President Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi behind. What an historic moment and how far we have come. So the timing of this conversation is personally very gratifying, but just politically where we are, and like you said, in the time of Biden-Harris, I don't know if you can see behind me, but I have the Obama Pride, which was in 2008 when he ran, and he proactively, and Nadine, you might remember this, and as well as Chris and Diego, when he proactively formed a thing called Obama Pride, in which he organized and mobilized the LGBT vote to get out the vote, like women's vote, labor vote. But then we have Biden-Harris, and I'm waiting for one more when Harris runs for the presidency and she picks her vice president. Anyway, just wanted to say that. And also, correction, Southerners on New Ground is based in Atlanta, Georgia, which is great, but it started here in Durham. I'm in Durham, North Carolina. I think the piece I want to add to the conversation is the fact that we have this amazing 4-year window, like you talked about, the Biden-Harris. But also, I'd like to maybe pose a question to the people who are on the call about this notion about whether we look at the idea of how change happens in the American society, the only one I know. And I'm thinking about when I was a junior in high school in 1965 in Schenectady, New York, home to GE. I remember it was our social studies teacher, Jack Hickey, who brought someone in from a group called the American Friends Service Committee, AFSC, Quakers. And Ricci, that one class when I was a junior in high school, was like 17, just set the foundation for my grounding and like why I do what I do. And so the fact that when you ask, you know, who we are and what we're involved in, what grounded us. But I remember I had never heard of a group called the American Friends Service Committee, but 3 things he said that day, the young man who came in, I wish I could find him. He talked about the Quakers being around, you know, full equality and justice for all, understood that. The second thing he said was this notion about the power of one. that each and every one of us has the potential to impact change. And I didn't quite get that, but it was the third thing he said. We have a high school work camp in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania who would like to go. I went, and it was like 12 of us. That one, summer camp, we met this two people called Guy and Candy Carowin from an organization called the Highlander Center in Tennessee. The Highlander Center, if you think about Rosa Parks, like if I said Rosa Parks, everyone knows who she is, right? Remember, she said, I'm not going to the back of the bus in Montgomery. But Rosa Parks was a member of the NAACP. The Highlander Center is kind of like, what is Woodhull? They intentionally wanted to make sure that they had Black and white folk coming together in in Tennessee to talk about how they were going to make change, intentionally being multiracial. So from the very beginning. So you had a young Dr. Martin Luther King who went to Highlander Center, and you had Rosa Parks, but it was this white couple, Guy and Candy Carowin, who came to my work camp in the Pocono Mountains, and they talked about the notion about how nonviolence, in terms of how they, as a white, predominantly white organization, but also as white folk singers, how could we impact change? And I'll leave with this wonderful message about how I think it matters. They said, we know we're white. We want to be allies to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So what they did, Ricky, they took a tape recorder and they went down to Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and they were recording the freedom songs and the freedom meetings happening with those Black churches. And one of the groups they recorded with the freedom singers ended up being Bernice Johnson Reagan of who? Sweet Honey in the Rock. So for me to hear from two white allies as a Black lesbian at the time, 17, realizing where we are now in 2021 are the lessons learned about how we move forward. And here's the most important part, I think. Demographics are going through the roof. Anyone on this call that was born between 46 and 64, the post-World War II baby boomers, that's us, we're about 74 million. But it's those 18 to 35-year-olds that are going to outnumber us really soon. So the question is, how do we intentionally and proactively interact with the 18 to 35-year-olds, our generation? And look what happened in Georgia. That race that happened, Osloff and Warnock, and that incredible multiracial, multi-generational, intentionally being, I guess, accessible in all kinds of ways. Look at that win, barely. And so I would say, in terms of where do we go from here, we have until 2024 to get things done. And I'll end with this. All politics is local. When I moved to North Carolina in 1982 from San Francisco, I could not tell you who represents me in Raleigh, North Carolina, where our state capital is. I would venture to ask anyone on this call, if you asked them, do you know who represents you where you are, Albany and New York, wherever it might be? And if the answer is no, we better get quick about knowing who they are, how they vote. And here in North Carolina, in November 8th, 2022, they're all up for re-election, every single one of them, as are all the members of the US House and Congress, and an X number of senators. So I think being engaged in hearts and minds and public policy, I would behoove us to all think about how we can do that going forward in terms of what we strategize and organize. And I guess the other two words will be bring it, because I think we can make a change, and I'm dedicated to making sure it can happen in partnership with Chris and Nadine and Diego and you all. Good?
Thank you. That was perfect.
All right. And I'll put the website links into the chat box for everybody.
Excellent. Please do.
Thank you.
To those of you who are in the room with us, if you have a question, there's a way to raise your hand. Apparently, if you click on reactions, or you can type your question in the chat window. Mandy, you teed me up perfectly to ask Chris, local, national, how do you decide? Where can an individual make the most difference? And now I'm going to add in, because as you know very well, Woodhull is focused, one of our focuses, is that foci? Okay, is youth engagement. And where do you start?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. So I'm biased because I got to know Nadine and Mandy and Diego when Carmen Vasquez hired me in 2004 to do state level work in New York as part of the Empire State Pride agenda. And so my roots are in state level policy change, which also means they're in local level policy change. And there's a disproportionate amount of attention, media coverage, money that goes into federal races, but I've never fully understood it. In my mind, it should be like this, right? Because when we would go to try and pass something in Albany, we would go around the state and we'd pass it locally in Rochester, and then in Syracuse, and then on Long Island, so that we could go to those state senators and assembly members and say, hey, this is now part of your community. You already got this. So can you support it at the state level? Oh, okay, great. Yeah, we'll support it at the state level. And then you go, great. Chuck Schumer, it's now the law of the land in New York State. Will you support this? That's how you make change happen. Rarely do you see some kind of federal congressional bill that happens that then kind of hasn't already had some level of experimentation in the states, right? Like the Equality Act will be transformative. And yet it is building upon the patchwork of states that had already passed similar packages and measurements. Marriage equality, civil unions, we had this patchwork of states that allowed the Supreme Court to rule the way it did. And so I'm biased, I'll end with two things. One is one of, I think, the best leaders in Congress right now is Pramila Jayapal, Congresswoman from Washington State. And she just tweeted out yesterday or posted on Instagram yesterday that, you know, in 2016, the Washington State Senate introduced a free community college bill, right? And it was not considered, oh, that could never happen. That would definitely not happen in Washington. President Biden, in his speech last night, called for free community college, right? So it's, you know, it is the states and local are the incubators, especially around policy. The other thing I'll say is Carmen, the term co-mentor. So I use that term instead of mentee, but a co-mentor of mine, Juan Rangel, he sent out an invitation to an event for this guy running called Guillermo Kramer, and he's running in Worcester, Massachusetts for city council. That's my hometown. He had no idea that this was my hometown. And so look him up. He's a great guy. I gave him some money, and he is running to be the first openly gay, first Latino. He's 26 years old, and he is running against these longtime establishment people that have been in Worcester because he knows of the changing demographics, the power of the youth vote, especially in a college town like Worcester. I think he's going to win, right? So I'm especially for young people that are interested, run for that city council seat, run for that local county commissioner. Like, you know, if you want to be a senator someday, especially, but even if you're just like, how do I help my community? That's the way to go.
Thank you. Chris, why don't you put that person's name in the chat? Thank you. So Nadine, I'm gonna come back to you for a moment. No, I'm not. I'm gonna go to Diego. No, I'm gonna go to Mandy. No, okay. I have so many things I want to talk about. So, you know, people said, wow, Stonewall. That was the start of the LGBT movement. Well, we know it wasn't the start. I think that a similar thing happened. Whoa, I thought you jumped off.
You left me so shocked. I dropped my computer.
I thought it was the ejector seat.
So bills, we look at a bill at the federal level and we say, oh my God, this is horrible, without recognizing that maybe 2 years, 4 years, 10 years, similar bills have been passing locally at the state level, and we don't see them because they have a different language, or maybe they're wrapped in something different. The challenge is knowing where to put efforts. As Nadine said, there's an enormous, gigantic box of bills coming toward us to frantically restrict. How do you decide where to put your efforts? Like, I know you're not speaking for PFLAG, Diego, but how would you answer that?
That's a great question. I honestly think it's sort of like, let me give you a different scenario and then you tell me the answer. So let's say you're in a room and there is someone on the other side of the room and each of them has a little ball. And each of them is going to take that little ball and roll it. So if they roll it in your direction, do you figure out which ball to chase? Or do you figure out where you are so that you can collect perhaps the most balls? And so I think that the centering of self, it's true in sports as well, speaking of the old topic, but the way that my roots, Chris was talking about his roots in state work, mine are municipal. I made changes. I was part of the Georgia Association of Student Councils when I was in high school, and we would go to a Presbyterian college named Berry College where we held our stuff. And Max Cleland and Sam Nunn came to teach us how to be leaders when Sam, before his first election, I ended up working on his first campaign because he was the most democratic thing there was. But in looking at where I think and where PFLAGers center on is telling your story. Focus on ways to connect with your own story that's resonative, and your story then can be received by every holder of every one of those balls, no matter where they start. Your story is the same if you're experiencing discrimination to a local store owner as it would be as a person who's guarding the street, the school crossing, as it would be for your city councilor, county commissioner, state rep or senator, governor, or president of the United States, or any of those three amazing people at the center of our view shot last night. The story is about people and their lives. And I ask people in PFLAG to frame their stories in three ways. The one is to talk about your experience, because everyone has experiences that deserve to be shared. But the other two that people sometimes forget to capture are, what are your hopes? What would you want the world to look like when you step into it? What would you want the world to be for the generations behind you? Don't be afraid to say what your hopes are. And the other is your fears. If we don't take action to make kids safer, we're not going to have productive citizens in the next generation, because they're going to have to deal with such behavioral health burdens that they won't get to the catalyst that actually makes them whole. So I believe that the root is the same. Learning how to tell your story will be the same, whether you're doing it to a grandparent or to a little kid or to an elected official or someone who's deciding whether to sell you a donut or a cantaloupe. Everyone judges through their own lens, and our job is to frame our story in a way that makes it comprehensible, one human to another, so it won't matter who the other human is. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Nadine.
Oh, I'm sorry. I should say one more thing. As an LGBTQ person, I know that we're always thinking that we're the best tellers of our own stories. Nothing about us without us, which is true. But fact is, something my old boss, Barney Frank, used to say, if we don't have allies, we're lost. And he used to give the example of saying, if I write a great bill, the best bill on the planet, and I introduce it in Congress, Who do I have? I've got Tammy Baldwin, who will co-sponsor it. And at the time, Jared Polis. So we've got 2 co-sponsors, a sponsor, and 3 votes. Well, that's not quite going to get it through Congress. We need people beside us who represent the view, not the views, but the lens, the experience, the potential for connection to the people we have to influence. Therefore, we need the family members. We need the influencers who can influence the people who may or may not listen to people like me, including me. And then we have to do the thing that Chris was talking about. It possibly was before this, but making sure that we're reaching across spheres of influence. Oh, it was on this call, the guy from Worcester. I'm on the Mass State Committee, so I totally got to reach out to this guy. Anyway, the real thing is that we need to have our allies in place to speak with us, not always for us, but to validate that what we're saying is sound, so that people who don't always think that what we're saying is sound are more apt to believe our validity as human beings. I'll stop there.
Nadine, I do want you to comment on the original question and if you want on Diego's, but I do want to share, we heard Loretta Ross last night. A group of us heard her speak about what I'll call circles of influence. And part of what she explained was we're in this little circle in the middle of a bullseye, and we're 90% of the people in that circle. And we keep spending lots of time trying to get the other 10 to make us 100%. Around us is a circle of people who may not be strong on everything that we care about, but in fact, she used the example that in the second circle, there could be a Girl Scout troop. Well, they're not going to go stand with you at an abortion clinic, but they would stand next to you for personal autonomy, for reproductive rights. And that second circle is the circle that can reach the third circle, who aren't ever going to talk to us, but they'll talk to the people in the second circle. And Diego, you reminded me of that. And I'm crediting Loretta Ross with that because it was just there. So Nadine.
Yeah, well, I think the reason that I've always been drawn to local and state politics more so than national is because it forces us to be in relationship with real people in ways that we cannot be caricatures and we cannot caricature them. And the process of passing, for example, a local human rights ordinance, a local non-discrimination ordinance, we would go through multiple iterations. We'd barely get any support. We'd have a hard time finding somebody to sponsor. Then the next time we get it sponsored and we'd get close to 50-50. And then the third time it would pass, sometimes with the very people who were our opposition that first time really wanting to lead the charge. So what changed? Part of it was the relationships that we built over time. I've had far right legislators say to me in meetings, Nadine, I don't know what's going on, whether it's me or you, but I'm starting to like what you're talking about, right? And it comes because it's shocking. It's always shocking to me when I spend time with people who are, technically our opposition, to find out the most fundamental misunderstandings that they have. How shocked they are to discover that, I'm fine with your religion. We don't have a problem there. Where we have a problem is with the suicide rate of young people who are being told specific things in your school. And I'm talking to you with the assumption that you don't want any student in your school to harm themselves. And then we can build on that common ground. So the proximity of local organizing sort of creates unusual bedfellows, strange, unexpected alliances that are really transformational. And I think that is why the work, just continues to be satisfying, because what we know at the end of the day is that the policy change is the smallest part of that victory. The lead up to it means that the community that you're organizing in the media, the faith leaders, the nonprofit organizations, all of these things that had to come together to get you to that tipping point have already transformed the community before the ordinance goes into effect. And in fact, if you said to me, you can secretly pass all of these ordinances, they'll exist on very thin ice. You'll always be afraid that you're one election away from losing them, or you can take a longer path. You'll suffer some losses. It'll take a longer time, but when it arrives, it will be solid, and it will come with the cultural change that all of that work required. I'll always take the second one, because at the end of the day, the most important thing about these laws isn't that a bunch of us are going to go file complaints, because even when you have these protections, the process, if you're working a minimum wage job and you get fired because you're gay, do you have the luxury of going through the process to get on the hope that you'll get, redress of your grievance? Or are you looking for another job the next day? But what we do when we go through the public education campaign is we open the door for and pass these policies. We open the door for the people who really need it, who really are going to go through the process, who are going to fight. But most importantly, we are setting a standard as a community that says, look, we expect you to treat people with dignity. We expect that you will not fire somebody because of their race, their gender, their ethnicity, their sexual orientation, their gender identity. That is our expectation. And if you don't conform to that, you're the one who's on the outside. You're the one that is ostracized in our society, not them. That's the real power of this organizing and this work. And the further you get from the place where you're actually talking to and can be in relationship with people, the more they become caricatures, the more you become caricatures. And so for me, I always want to be rooted in the place where I can look the people in their eyes who are making decisions about my life. And finally, I will say this: when it comes to the day-to-day lives of me as a woman, as a Black woman, as a Black lesbian, what happens in my city council and what happens in my state house is affecting me more readily and more directly than what's happening out of Washington. It's just So, and finally, to Chris's point, everything that we do at that local and state level cumulatively shifts the culture and makes things possible in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Mandy, you had your hand up.
I was just going to say ditto to everything Nadine said. I was sitting here thinking about the fact that all politics is local. And I was just realizing, I remember in 2008, when we had the Hillary Clinton versus Obama race that was going on for the presidency, I really did believe this country would never, ever, ever elect a Black man over a woman. And I'm glad I was wrong. But there's a whole lot of, gender stuff going on there about, well, he's a man, whatever. But now we're sitting here in the year 2021, and Nadine said something interesting. And I just wonder if we're at a moment that we should have, the minute you turn 18, you're automatically registered to vote. I mean, what's that voting act they have going on up there in the US Congress right now, saying that there needs to be, an automatic access to everyone having the right to vote when you turn 18. You don't have to go through a lot of hoops and challenges.
John Lewis.
That's it. And in fact, we got, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge, in 2015, when you think about the Civil Rights Act. And I guess, and can I just put like a date on the calendar? It's interesting. When Obama ran, he got the win. And then you had Obama, Biden. But I remember, Nadine, you remember we were always doing these every 10-year anniversaries of that March on Washington, August 1963, 28. But it wouldn't be until August of 1983 when Audre Lorde got to speak on that main stage in opposition to a lot of folk who didn't want her to be there on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, being an out Black lesbian, but she was. Mark that moment. But then on August 28, 2013, literally 50 years to the day, Barack Obama, President Obama, stood on that exact same spot and talked about the importance of Bayard Rustin, how far we've come, and now anything is possible. But getting back to all politics is local. We're about ready to get a 14th congressional district here in North Carolina. I don't know how many Floridians are moving up here, Nadine. They might like the weather better in North Carolina. But the reality is, if anyone moves here, there has to be what the Equality Federation, where you live, who represents you, all the way from city council, soil and water, whatever. And how do we, Ricci, and how does the Woodhall get involved with this about everyone knowing who represents them at every single level of where they live, where they shop, where they go to the hospital, whatever, and trying to make that a part and parcel of how we, you know, coordinate and organize our lives in a way. So that notion about the changing of hearts and minds, pride marches, you know, spoken word, you know, and the changing of public policy, registering the vote, getting involved. And how do we make that like a daily occurrence in terms of where we live, and not only in English, it has to be in Spanish and also ASL. But I'll end with this. I think the interesting challenge is going to be for us going forward. The next election is going to be November 2024. Don't wait. Now would be the time to figure out where you are, who you are, what's around you, who the allies are. And Chris, you said, I think Chris, you said this really important. Allies are critical. Nadine, if you remember when we were doing an ordinance down there in Hillsborough County, who was that? There was that Black minister who said, and I quote, "If the Klan were to march against the gays, I would march with them." I'll never forget that quote as long as I live, and think about
Jane Sykes.
There you
Reverend
go.
Jane Sykes. There he
I'll
is.
leave it there. So change is possible. We have to make it a collective we.
Well, you know what? I'm not going to try and wrestle control from you, Ricci, but I want to bring Chris into this.
That's where
specifically about this point, because you know, the mobilization of LGBTQ voters and what we call pro-equality voters, the people who love us, for whom our freedom is a litmus test issue, is the most undernourished part of the electoral landscape. And there are few, and part of it is because, you know, we are used to organizing around what's on your voter registration form. You know, so in states where it's your race, your age, your gender, the resources go to those well-worn grooves for reasons that are obvious. You can pull that off the form. But because we have invested as a community deeply in state and local organizing, we have databases that are massive now, you know, hundreds of thousands of voters who are passionate about this issue, more than 1 million voters that we've identified state after state. And we are difference makers in races. We provide the margin of victory or defeat, but we do it really with crumbs. And I was just thinking about you know, we started off talking about the runoff in the Senate in Georgia. And I remember I jumped onto a federation call. And so Jeff Graham didn't know I was on the call to say these things, but and he said, you know, when the runoff was announced, the first call that I got came from Equality Florida, and they shared their blueprint for voter turnout. He said they offered their volunteers, they immediately enlisted their donors to support us. And I remember he said, and most of all, they told us to dream bigger, and we did. And they worked in coalitions, they rallied leaders, and in 8 weeks, they'd raised nearly $1 million. And those resources let them turn out 850,000 pro-equality voters. You know, and I love that Stacey Abrams gave them a shout out in her Twitter feed, but what they were able to pull off with that investment, talking to LGBTQ and pro-equality voters, these are votes being left on the table state after state after state. Florida we're a state that is one of the few that get resources, but in comparison, very little. And I know Chris has been a big part of finding ways to marshal funders to think more strategically about, you know, how our community and our allies can weigh in.
Yeah, thanks, Nadine. And I'm just like loving absorbing all of this brilliant. I mean, it's great. I'm loving this conversation. Mandy, your poster behind you reminds me of the Obama organizing. I ran the Colorado Pride outreach when I lived in Denver in 2008. And I remember we had Denver Pride, which is one of the biggest prides in the country. It's like hundreds of thousands of LGBTQ people go to it. And I had the sort of allies that were there organizing, and they were floored by how many people were signing up and how many people were excited and how many people were ready to go. And they're like, oh my God, this is like 10 times the rate of the county fairs, the weather stuff we go to, where people just don't, I'm not interested. And I was like, yeah, our community has to be, because we've been forced to, we don't have the luxury to just ignore politics. And let's be clear, I started the DC Gay Flag Football League. I'm involved with the National Gay Flag Football League. There is no known crisis that I know of trans athletes in America. This is fabricated, like Nadine said, this is fabricated and using kids. I want to swear here, but I won't. This is kids for culture wars, because some freaking idiots tested this and said that we could probably rally our base and make some good money off this to win back power. And it's offensive, it's disgusting, and it is, I think it's a very short-sighted and failed strategy, right? And I applaud, especially those Republicans, you got to applaud the Republicans where you can, right? I applaud the Republican governors that are willing to veto this and try to have light of day between, you know, the Trump version of their party and whatever else might exist, right? And it's just, it's one, Nadine, you're exactly right. There are funders, including some on this call, who are generous, who give. And one of the things we're trying to do through the Q Trust, which Nadine was referencing, is to get more of the donors to see the connections, to stay in the fight, and make it easy as possible for them to give to the equality groups that are, you know, rubbing two pennies together compared to a lot of the other budgets that are out there to try and really fight back against these awful things.
I am horrified to discover that it's 6 minutes of 5. I'm horrified because I just want to keep talking or listening, really. So I'm going to ask each of you, we're going to start with you, Diego. Is it a time of hope? Keeping in mind, as we've said, 2024 is going to be here very soon. Mm-hmm. If we don't start now, I don't even have to contemplate it. So what's your hope? What's your hope?
I absolutely find hope, and I find hope in our own history. I mean, there was a time when Rosa Parks, her big stand was not seen as something anyone would ever do. I look at in North Carolina, Charlotte City Council standing up and doing a non-discrimination ordinance is what ticked off the state government. And then they did something, we call it HB2, but actually first I think it was HB4. It was HB4, and then it came back around and it's HB2. And then it was all about attacking trans kids. And this was because of the Charlotte City Council saying, no, we are standing up for our people. They took the HB2 thing, thanks to businesses and sports leagues stepping up. Some didn't, many did. Some based in North Carolina didn't, should have. Can you spell NASCAR? And the point is that after that, we're looking at right now where families came together, and it's not just sports, it's medical treatment. It's parents being criminalized for giving kids their medication, whether it's hormone blockers or any kind of medication that's transition related. It's also the people who are pharmacists that fill those scripts, the physicians who write the scripts. And then there's also the identity documents laws. But the people of North Carolina came together. All the allies everywhere came together and said no. And as of, I think it's today, all of those bad bills in North Carolina are dead. And I talked with the Equality NC today, and they really think it's really dead. Sometimes, you know, some of these play vampire, and they come back at the dark. But these are dead, and it's because of the strength of companies and people, families standing up, allies standing with LGBTQ people. So I have hope, because even when it's tough, we end up squeaking through. And the two governors who vetoed South Dakota and Arkansas, salute. You know, you have people who are naysayers. Oh, they did it because they knew that they would be overridden. No, it still takes guts to veto. People don't forget that, and neither will we. So, yes, it is a time for hope. Our stories are bigger, our unity is bigger, and our numbers are greater.
Yep, I agree. This is Mandy 10 of 10, not if, when. And let's not forget, this country, when it was settled, when women weren't allowed to vote and we came as property, and look where we are now. Not if, but when. 100%. Yeah, it's going to happen. Nadine, what do you say? And Chris?
Yeah, well, I will say this. I think we are at a decision point in America. We are being pulled by two forces. One is white fear of a browning country. You know, the browning of America and the graying of America continue to be the defining demographic shift that is behind the embrace of Trumpism. And so America has a reckoning with race that it must navigate, and everything else flows from that. I also think that we have democracy and disinformation are the other, demographics, democracy, and disinformation. By that, I mean, if they are able to dismantle the machinery that allows us to translate power to the people so that it actually makes a difference. But if you can circumscribe who gets to vote, then it doesn't matter if you change hearts and minds. It only matters if you change the right hearts and minds. And that 30% that cheers on these attacks on trans kids, if they're the ones who disproportionately get to vote, then all of those hearts and minds work that we do is diminished. And the disinformation piece, again, I go back to how important it is to organize on the local level, because your neighbor is getting their information. You know, it's not that we're all sitting around watching the same television shows with Walter Cronkite or whomever. We are getting information that through an algorithm of self-reinforcing ideas. So your neighbor may be getting a completely different information stream and you don't even know it. You don't even have touch points. We don't have front porch where we talk about these things. And so that level of isolation, you know, increasingly the information from reputable places is behind a firewall, a paywall, and bad information and disinformation is free and abundant. And so, the places, the shared square where we get to come to common understandings are shrinking unless we compel them through local organizing. So I am hopeful because I know how far we've come. And I also know that justice does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, as Dr. King said. So we got a lot of work to do. This is a critical moment. We can speed forward or we can find ourselves mired for many, many years in our failure to seize this moment.
And I'll just say, not 2024, elections are happening right now. Municipal elections are happening. Ricky, you have a Philadelphia DA's race coming up. They're happening right now. And I'll just end, someone just gave me this book, Amanda Gorman, who is the gorgeous poet at Biden's inauguration. And this poem, The Hill We Climb, ends, if you allow me. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light. If only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Callie, our wonderful interpreter, thank you so much.
Yay.
Hey, Florida.
Thank you.
And Mel, thank you for making our technology work flawlessly this afternoon. And thank you again, Mandy, Diego, Chris, Nadine. You're like my kitchen cabinet.
Time, Ricky.
Honored to
Thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Love you guys. Take care.
Love you.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.